Good morning, everyone. Thank you, President, and can I wish you the very best of luck in your new campus here. A very interesting tradition here, and you've brought the university through huge change. You now have 16,000 students, and I want to wish you the very best in the future, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing for Irish education. You're playing an extremely central role, and indeed having this conference here today with Maura, I think it's a reflection of the cutting-edge issues which you have taken on both in Irish education and internationally. So I'd like to begin by welcoming our guests, our visitors here this morning. I hope you realise that we're in very good humour here today. You did hear about that goal last night, did you? I don't know if there's any Italians in the audience, but you'll forgive me if I say that we're very happy. We're very happy today with that wonderful goal last night. It's put the whole country into very good humour. As a politician, I hope it lasts, and we certainly should get a few days out of it, and we have the next match on Sunday. So we've also had some good weather this morning, so I hope that lasts for the duration of your visit and that you have a very good time while you're here in Dublin, and that you enjoy our capital city. We also in the Dáil yesterday had our summer statement of our economic development, and we have been through a very difficult time in this country economically. But the good news at the moment is that we are the fastest growing economy. We've seen, thankfully, a huge dip in our unemployment rates, and we now have new issues in relation to many of the problems, if you like, of prosperity in terms of providing housing and dealing with other issues for our people. So you come at an interesting time to Dublin, and I'm sure you will find this seminar very useful and helpful. As has been said, it's about networking, it's about excellence and being at the cutting edge of your topic and having an opportunity to explore that. And as somebody who in my past life has been a member of European networks, I've certainly found them only to my advantage and to the advantage of the topic. And I think it's great credit to Maura and to all of you to be involved in the way you are in such an important topic of our times. You will recall in 2013, Maura, that when Ireland held the presidency of the Council of the European Union, and in the course of that presidency, Maura had the opportunity to set out the aims of the VOX-Pol project to the member states. And it was also during the term of that presidency that Ireland commenced a revision of the Union strategy for the countering of radicalisation and recruitment to terrorism, in which the obvious ongoing need to address the online dimension to radicalisation was recognised. And I can say to you, indeed, since that time, and indeed just 2 weeks ago, I was in Luxembourg at the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers meeting, where this topic and the whole question of dealing with the challenges we face from terrorism was centre stage once again, including the topics that you're discussing over the next few days. Your project has a very specific focus on drilling into the detail of the phenomenon of online radicalisation. Of course, the online space plays roles in radicalising individuals to violence. That is undeniable. If nothing else, the internet and social media provide a mass medium for propaganda on a scale and with a sophistication never seen before. And we really are in many ways, and it varies obviously depending on one's interest and knowledge about this, but I think we really are only at early enough days of beginning to understand the depth of this phenomenon, and certainly from a political point of view and from a government point of view and across departments, we clearly have work to do. And it's a topic of huge interest, not just, of course, to a Justice Department, but right across the whole of government, and does need a whole of government response as well. And that's something that we've been discussing at the JHA meetings. I think we've lots of questions still to ask and to answer, including the impact on individuals, on our society. These are very key questions. We don't have all of the answers, as I say. What is the impact of the internet and social media in terms of radicalisation in a more personalised individual affair? Is that what it is, that operates more at the level of tapping into one-to-one experience? I think that's certainly part of the discussion. It's not the whole discussion, of course, because it's much more than that. But I think there are very interesting questions about whether it's individual vulnerability, as we've seen in certain situations, but we do need to get a better understanding of that phenomenon, and it will only be addressed, I believe, by very dedicated long-term research, such as you were doing, and it's absolutely key. And as someone who comes from a social work background and a social administration and sociology, I think the whole phenomenon, challenges at so many different levels. At a societal level, an individual level. There are so many different aspects, and I think your programme reflects that. We will all recall the spirit of hope for a democratic future that the Arab Spring offered to many millions across North Africa and the Middle East. The reality has unfortunately turned out very differently because of the instability created by the overthrow of regimes. It has been exploited by extremists, and we have seen appalling bloodshed. In particular, we have witnessed the ongoing tragedy of civil war in Syria and the rise of the Islamic State, a group set apart by its particular and peculiar appetite for unspeakable levels of violence and oppression. I think the inhumanity of which has just left us all absolutely speechless. And the consequences have been very far-reaching. We've seen appalling bloodshed, not only but principally in Iraq and Syria, and we have also seen a migration crisis of historic proportions. We gave a commitment to have 4,000, for example, Syrian refugees in this country. And when I went to meet some of the first Syrians who arrived in here, and when you sit down and talk to people at an individual level, and the scale of the impact on those families, the life-changing events they've witnessed, the horrors they've been through, and the difficulties they're now experiencing in relation to getting a safe haven, it just brings into that really stark relief the appalling individual and family consequences. And when I see for example, some of the Syrians who are here were showing me the photographs of their homes in different parts of Syria, and to see their communities absolutely destroyed. Their whole way of life gone, and indeed some relatives still in those places like Aleppo and elsewhere. It certainly brings home to you precisely what we are dealing with. Over the course of the period we're speaking about, we've seen also the rise of the phenomenon of young men and women radicalised by many means and travelling to train or participate in conflict with extremist groups. These foreign terrorist fighters, as they have become known, have fallen prey to the very violent ideology of the Islamic State, or groups like it, who, like Al-Qaeda before them, have hijacked faith to justify brutal self-interest. And it was perhaps sadly inevitable that some of the individuals would return home, radicalised, trained and motivated to commit violent acts, which is so challenging for all our states. Extremism, unfortunately, is no longer an abstract problem that happens somewhere else. It's here, it's right across Europe. In recent years, we've also seen the sophisticated, premeditated and shocking attacks by groups of radicalised people, notably the recent attacks in Paris and Brussels. We've also seen very indiscriminate acts of killing, violence, the recent brutal killing of the French police officer and his wife. These attacks have involved individuals who have claimed the ideology of Islamic State as their motivation. But we must, of course, recall that not all of this violence is perpetrated by people motivated by conflict in the Middle East. We have also seen, as the President mentioned, the rise of the extreme xenophobic or nationalistic tendency, the cold and calculated mass slaughter we saw in Norway, the tragic, mindless murder last week of the British MP, Joe Cox, point up a radicalisation to violence motivated by a different ideology, but one that is no less founded in hatred. It is firmly recognised at European Union level that addressing this problem is not only a matter of deploying the traditional policing and security approaches to countering terrorism. Measures such as these are entirely appropriate and necessary, as I'm sure you'll all agree, in the context of keeping our citizens safe in the face of the current terrorist threat, and will continue to form a very key part of the response to the threat that we face. The actions we take in cooperation with our EU colleagues must strike a balance. While we must respond to the migration crisis with humanity and respect for fundamental rights, these are core values for us, we must also ensure that we protect our borders from abuse. And I think one of the more challenging aspects of the discussions we've had in recent times is where migration can be sometimes equated, with threats that we face as our society, and we have to be very clear about how we respond in a humanitarian and human rights way to the huge refugee crisis that we face, while at the same time being conscious of the security issues and the abuse of the migration routes that can be undertaken by those who seek to do harm. And that's a very real issue that we have to be ever alert to. So we do have to enhance our security response by increasing the resources devoted to it, particularly by developing smarter systems for the greater sharing of intelligence and information in order to seek to prevent attacks. At the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers' meeting again, just 2 weeks ago, we spent much time discussing the whole interoperability of databases. And I know as a group of academics very interested in working hard in this whole area, you will be very challenged, I think, and we are all challenged by the debate between privacy and sharing of information and security. And I don't think anyone has the complete answer to this, but it is certainly an issue we need to think very carefully about, because we don't want to sacrifice basic values, and at the same time we have to ensure that we protect our citizens, and these are difficult challenges. We do want to protect a society that values privacy and free expression as basic rights, and we don't want to unnecessarily impinge on these freedoms. And I think this is going to be a real debate in the years ahead, this balancing. We saw it in the European Parliament, for example, where the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers were very much pushing to have the Passenger Name Records Directive implemented for obvious reasons. And we saw the European Parliament, and I'm sure you're familiar with the debate that took place there, where they rather reluctantly came round, and one can understand the range of concerns to supporting the PNR, and did finally after we had the Brussels tragedy. The decentralised and almost individualised nature often of the current internationalist terror threat and how it has evolved and is motivated requires, as I've said, a broader response to support security measures and perhaps asks deeper questions of us as a society. And the questions I would raise in relation to this whole debate are, and I think they inevitably arise, they're questions about how do we treat and integrate minority communities, how and whether our traditional social values and organisations are open to change and evolution that respects and embraces minorities, how we can work against social and economic disadvantage that may tend to isolate communities or individuals, and sometimes makes those communities more vulnerable, not just to the type of crime we're talking about here today, but to all sorts of crime. And clearly, dealing with socio-economic disadvantage is very key as well in protecting individuals. And we also, another question is how any and all of these factors can make some more vulnerable than others to being preyed upon by extremists. And yet it must be recognised that the vast majority of people simply wish to go about their lives in peace and to make a positive contribution to society. They do not support or resort to violence. They value democratic principles and the freedoms that they underpin. Whether it is our majority or minority communities, we must be extremely careful that none should be stigmatised by the actions of a few. There is always a risk that the freedoms and rights we strive so hard to protect can, as I said, become eroded by the very measures that seek to preserve them. The tasks that faces us in this regard is writ large in the area of information and data sharing for police and security services, and how that can be facilitated and enhanced while at the same time guaranteeing privacy and data protection. There is significant work in the EU on this topic. As you know, it's been a constant theme for my discussions with colleagues and will continue to be an area of activity, as I've said. I've already mentioned about the debate, the very interesting debate on the PNR. Indeed, all of the proposals are founded in the data protection package recently agreed at EU level that I hope will provide a modern data protection framework which will give citizens enhanced confidence that the protection of their personalised data is regulated clearly, robustly and proportionately, especially when it is used by law enforcement for combating crime and terrorism. As I said earlier, and as you know very well more than anyone, the online space has also become a major propaganda platform for international terrorism and for radicalising individuals to violent acts. How people communicate has changed. Don't need to go over it here, but clearly the change in communications has allowed people to access and communicate information in so many positive ways, but it has also allowed those with malicious motives to do the same. And it isn't acceptable that the preaching of hatred and violence should go unaddressed in this forum, in this online forum. There is a strong realisation of the need for governments and the major tech companies and internet service providers to work together on this issue. I don't have time to go into the details of the various initiatives that are taking place both at European and national level in relation to that partnership between tech companies and government, but I think there's great potential there. And I know there are representatives from the industry here today. And I think there's much that we can do at an informal level as well as perhaps at a legislative level. But I wouldn't underestimate how much can be done in terms of partnership and that relationship between the internet service providers and governments. And I think that partnership will be crucial to our efforts to create a safer online environment, but because it is our young people and the most vulnerable in our societies that can be most susceptible to those preaching hatred and violent radicalisation. That said, I do want to conclude by commenting on the work that you do. Obviously, the empirical research that takes a long-term and interdisciplinary approach can help us to identify with much more certainty exactly what are the factors that are involved in online violent radicalisation. I do believe, and I'm a strong believer in this, that effective policies can be built on credible research. In fact, it would be my view that we need to have much more contact between the research community and government, and we need to move more and more towards policy based on good, high-quality research. And I think there's scope for a lot more bridge building between our universities and politicians, and I think our universities recognise that. It's all a question, I think, of having the right mechanisms in place in order to do that. But I think it can only be to the benefit of the policies that we all hope to see in place if we can build that partnership as well. I suppose one of the things I've been most struck by since being Minister for Justice and Minister for Children is how much we need to develop those bridge-building mechanisms and those partnerships to ensure that we have effective government, both across departmentally and cross institutions. I think it's really critical, and as researchers, I think you will appreciate that. I'll conclude again by welcoming our guest speakers. Thank you for taking the time to come to this seminar, and well done to DCU, Tamora and President Breen for giving you all of the opportunity to do your valuable work here in Dublin. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope you have a very useful and enjoyable seminar. Thank you very much indeed.